So we have with us today Professor Hillel Chiel, who is professor in the Department of Biology in the College of Arts and Sciences. And he is very humble about this, but he's an award-winning educator. He was awarded a prize by the Science magazine over the last couple of years for his outstanding teaching. And he has been a very active partner with us in the process, not only in teaching his own class, but providing mentorship to some of our younger faculty in the program as well. So we're thrilled to have him here today. And with him, we have two of his graduate students. We have Jeff Gill, who is a PhD student in biology, and Diana Christian, who is an undergraduate in biology with a math minor. Thank you.
So thanks all for coming. I appreciate this very much. What I think I'm going to do, so first, as I said, if Jennifer does show up, rushes in and wants to take over, I will just stop and let her do so. I can't, unfortunately, give a presentation about her stuff because I didn't teach her class. What I wanted to do today is to briefly talk about the philosophy, how it developed, how it's set up. Then I'm going to have each of my students talk briefly. Jeff actually took the course that I'm talking about as a lecture course and then served as a teaching assistant for it as an active learning course, so he's going to address that. And Diana not only took the active learning course that we had created last semester, but she decided to take the other course that I teach this semester. So that's already a vote of confidence that I very much appreciate. Okay, so let me say something about the background and then give you some things to look at. The problem I had when I first started teaching, I didn't know how to tell how somebody knew something. It's almost an epistemological question. How do you know that someone knows something? So I thought about it a great deal. And one of the ways I think you can tell whether someone knows something is if you give them a problem they haven't seen before and they can solve that problem with the information you've given them. Because if they can simply repeat back what you've said, that's not really a sign that they know anything. It means that they can repeat back what you said. But parrots can do that just as well. That doesn't, from my point of view, indicate that they've really internalized or mastered any material. So even as I taught my courses as lecture courses, I worked very hard to try to learn students' names from the outset and to foster discussion to the extent I could. But I was deeply unsatisfied, even though I actually got positive feedback from many students. They said I was a nice lecturer and they enjoyed listening to me and I was entertaining, and that was all very gratifying. But then I would come into class, the next class, and I would ask questions that should be no-brainers if they had been there and really had gotten the material, and it was like pulling teeth, worse than pulling teeth. It was rarely there. And one of the things I also noticed is students would take what were reasonable prerequisite courses, and when I would start asking them, do you know this material, almost no one would ever admit to actually knowing things that I could then depend on their having and using. That was shocking to me. Of course, I still remember what I was like as a student, so it shouldn't have been shocking at all. You know, when you volunteer this kind of stuff, then you're going to get picked on by the teacher. And of course, to say that you know something, then to be embarrassed in front of all your peers showing that you really don't know it, that's not a good feeling. So I began to realize that there was a problem with lectures. Not that I did them poorly, but that fundamentally they weren't the most effective way. They were efficient. I could get through lots of material, but they weren't effective in terms of getting students to master stuff. That was the problem I was struggling with. So several years ago, with the aid of a student who's just graduated this past semester, Kendrick Shaw, and has gone back, he is an MD PhD student, and he's now on the wards, which is why he can't be here. Kendrick volunteered. He had actually gotten a master's here in computer science and had worked for Microsoft for several years and then came back and decided he wanted to be an MD PhD. And he was my grad student, and he decided that he would volunteer to help me build simulations for this course that had been a lecture course. So the students, instead of listening to me talk about things, would have a virtual laboratory experience. They could actually go in and start doing experiments. Now, you immediately say, oh, well, okay, I guess that's okay for science. What could I do for humanities? You'll see some of the examples that people have done. There's vast amounts. And in some sense, I should mention this, I majored in English as an undergraduate at Yale. Part of the thing I found much more inspiring in my English courses, because after the first few, the teachers actually cared about what you had to say. You had to write essays about things, and you had to think deeply about texts and analyze them, and they actually sometimes thought that ideas you had were good. Whereas in science courses, there's a lot of memorization, fill in the blanks, multiple choice, and there wasn't a lot of creativity. Science really became exciting for me personally when I started to get into the laboratory and starting to work on real problems, not just sort of cookbook stuff, but things that I didn't know the answers to, that nobody knew the answers to, because that's when science becomes what it really is. It's a frontier experience. So the way the course is structured, we have a syllabus, which I'm showing here. Every date is a clickable link. This is a wiki that we've set up. And you can, by the way, if you copy down the address, which you're welcome to do so, this is open. You can't see the grades unless you're logged in, which is appropriate. But otherwise, you can see any part of this, and you're welcome to do so. So it's neurowiki.case.edu, and I encourage you to go and spend time looking at it. But one of the things I did, which not everyone does, is I told the students what my educational goals were at the outset. And I told them how the structure of the course and everything I was going to do to assess them was focused on achieving those educational goals. So for example, mastery of fundamental principles of neuroscience. Well, that's a nice broad goal. What does that mean? That means that if you were challenged to actually use those principles to analyze a neuroscience problem, you could do something about it. Analyze neurons and neural circuits for normal behavior and disease, and design neurons and networks for flexible adaptive behavior. Then I also wanted them to apply critical thinking skills, learning how to write about scientific problems, and learning to work in teams to solve open-ended problems. And I have to give a shout out to the summer program that Tina and Brian and others so ably ran, because one of the things they had us do was to define what our main goals and what our ancillary goals were, and that's how this ended up there. I had similar goals, but I hadn't articulated them quite as well as after that session. It was very helpful. And then one of the things I made explicit, this is a neuroscience course, and learning involves changing the brain. That's the physical structure that changes. You know, you exercise, your muscles get bigger, you learn things, things change inside your brain. So how you learn and the process of learning is something that you can actually understand better if you take a course in neuroscience and understand how the elements that make up your brain, the neurons, those cells that talk to each other and wire together, how they work. So I was pointing out to the students that if they did well in the course, they could actually learn something that could help them in many other courses and not just in neuroscience. And talked a little bit about what those issues were. And then how do you assess? And so there's a series of questions, and then you basically tell the students, this is what I'm going to be measuring. One of the things that students do, they're very smart. If you tell them, I'm interested in critical thinking, and then you have them answer multiple choice questions, well, those might involve some critical thought, but you're not having a discussion with them, and you're not usually asking them to exercise any critical skills. So they memorize, use templates, and get through the course and get their A, because that's what you really want. I mean, but it doesn't matter what you say, it's what you really want is how you test them. So if you don't assess in ways that actually tie to those goals, you're not doing anything. And again, one of the things I emphasize is that intellectual skills are not just verbal things, they're tools. They're things that you can use. And I talked to them about how if you're going to hire somebody to build you a chair or a table, and all they know is PowerPoints about what chairs and tables look like and what tools look like, they're going to be hopeless. You wouldn't waste your time or money on such people. Similarly, if students are supposed to master intellectual tools and all they do is watch PowerPoints and they don't use them, they're not going to be able to do anything with them. So our assessment involves having the students work together in class on problems, and I'll just give you a glimpse of some of those problems. And then they work together, and then we do what are called lightning checkoffs at the beginning of the next class. We just talk to them, what have you done, show us the work. And then we come back for what we call conceptual checkoffs, where we actually speak in depth with each team of 2 students and get some sense of how it went. The key point was that every assessment was tied to the educational goals. We went through that at the beginning of class. Jennifer made a very important point, which is that students don't like change. So if you start off a class and you suddenly change the rules or you start doing funny things, students will feel that you're not doing your job. And if your job is to stand up here and lecture, and then you, without telling them, stop doing that, then they really will feel you're not doing your job. So if the first day of class, what I do is I devote a lecture to telling them how I'm going to do my job and what their job will be. And so the expectations are clear. And since it's still during add drop, If they need to vote with their feet, that's fine. What we found is that generally, as long as we do this in a positive way and emphasize to students the benefits, and that's one of the things we do emphasize, most students actually find it an exciting adventure rather than another hoop they have to jump through that a professor is demanding from them. Now, the thing I want to now focus on is what they actually do in class. What we did was we built a whole set of simulations, because neural stuff is understood well enough that you can actually build models that are very good replicas of what's going on. And because computers are so fast now, you can actually have them run these models in real time and get results. Now, just to give you a perspective, this thing over here is showing what's called an action potential. As I'm speaking to you and the sound waves are traveling to your eardrum and your eardrum is doing various complicated things, there are axons, these are cables, that are actually firing these things, these electrical impulses that are going into your auditory cortex, and then your brain is interpreting these as words. Okay? So this is the actual mechanism that your brain is using, the action potential. It was first described in the squid giant axon back in the late 40s and early 50s. So to give you a sense of the difference in computing power, to go from here to here, to compute that difference by Hodgkin and Huxley, who were the ones who originally described it, they used hand crank calculators. And one person met them during the winter, and they commented that this was really helpful. There was no central heating, so this kept them warm. And then someone came and visited them in late July, and they were very excited because the action potential was starting to repolarize. It was going down and then coming back up. Okay, so it was months of very hard work to do what now we can do, as you'll see, in an instant. This is written by Kendrick Shaw and now Jeff Gill, and also Lyle Gleit, who couldn't be here today, in JavaScript. And so this is all running locally on each student's computer. There's no central server, which means that you can have hundreds of students. This could scale globally if you wanted to, because the computing cycles are being done by the local computing device. All we do is serve a web page that has the JavaScript on it. So if I decided to ask the student, tell me what happens when you fire an action potential faster, don't wait 10 milliseconds, just wait 5, they see suddenly that it disappears. I say, well, let's go up a little bit higher, 6. Oh, so between 5 and 6, something has changed so that now you can again fire an action potential. Cool. So they can do experiments as if they were in the laboratory working with an animal, but no animals are harmed in the doing of these experiments. And then what we have them do is put together notebooks on the wiki. So this is an example of one of the notebooks for one of the sessions on the action potential, where the student can put in words, first our questions, their responses, data that they've gotten snapshots of from doing the simulation, and they can answer these questions and really understand the material, but they can write about it at the same time. And then we, of course, when we do our lightning checkoffs, we see that they have notebook entries, and then in the conceptual checkoffs, we actually go through what they've written and talk to them about that. So a few quick things I'm just going to conclude with. Allowing students to see dynamic processes makes them come alive. Here's a simulation that Jeff actually wrote that shows diffusion. So I can talk about diffusion until I'm blue in the face. But if you actually see these little things moving over to the other side, and then some of them trying to come back, you understand what the diffusive process actually is. And for electrochemistry, this turns out to be absolutely essential. This is often very abstract, and by teaching it using these simulations, which the students can manipulate and interact with, it comes alive and they can understand it far better. And you can see after a very short time, equilibrium established between the two halves. And that, again, I use all those words, but you see what's going on. The things are just leaking over to the other side, and then some of them are leaking back, and there it is. So that makes it much, much easier to get across concepts that would be very hard otherwise. And the last thing I want to say a few words about is that we've started analyzing some of the data that we've taken. So we give them surveys at the beginning, middle, and end of the semester, asking things like, how much do you like neuroscience? How competent are you in neuroscience? How much do you like learning through reading? How well do you learn through reading? How much do you like using simulations to understand biological systems? How competent are you in using simulations? How much do you like working in teams? And how well do you contribute to a team working on solving problems? So we have an assessment here of how they're doing. And one of the things that's cool is that we've done some of the analyses, and competence in neuroscience from the beginning to the end does significantly increase, as does the feeling that you can use simulations to learn things. And some of the students also very much like being able to read. Teamwork is a little bit more fraught, and that's something we're still hoping to work on. The other thing is that we give an assessment quiz before the students work on the simulations in class, but after they're supposed to read the material that's on the NeuroWiki, and then we give it again after they've done these experiments in class. And the significance, I don't have the data to report, but we've looked at it. It's remarkable how much better the students do the second time, because having actually worked with these concepts and tried to do something with them, they're much more in their heads. So that was all I had to say. What I'd like to do before we open up to questions is let both Jeff and Diana say their thing. I think I'd like Diana to speak first as a student, and then Jeff can talk a little bit about his experience.
Okay. So one of the things that I really liked about this class was because it was active, there wasn't any way to cut corners or to slack off. And you came to class every day knowing that you had your partner relying on you knowing what was going on, and that you needed to be there and to be working and to constantly be focused. And because of the way that the class was set up, it was really easy to do that. I know that in some of my other classes, you're fighting to stay awake, you're taking notes as fast as you can to keep up with the lecture, and this one, it was because you were reading and you were doing the simulation, it was all at your own pace, and if you stopped and needed to think, you could, and you could also go back to you always had to go back to the reading and sort of reread it to make sure you understood it, and then you could show that you understood it through all of the problem sets. And one of the really exciting things that ended up happening, at least for me, is that by the end of the class, by the sort of second half of it, we'd be given these problems, and I'd start out by just going to the simulation and seeing what I could see, and then I'd find these cool little interesting things, and then when I was doing the problem set, I would come to problems that I had already answered just on my own, that didn't need to be asked, which was really cool, because I could say, I already answered that. So, and you can, like, if you're really interested in it, you can go kind of off topic and see if you can change different things and get different outcomes or something. But I'd say it was a really, really positive experience being in this class, especially considering I came back for the second one. And one of the things is I tell people about this class a lot too. I tell them, like, it is kind of a lot of work, but that's because you can't slack off on the work, is you have to do it. And even though it's a lot of work, it's really fun, and it's good work, and it's engaging, and you don't mind having to do all of that work. And I know I'll finish just by saying that yesterday I was telling one of my friends that I was going to wake up early on my day off and come to this active learning seminar, and he thanked me on behalf of students everywhere. Because I've told him about this class, and like all of the students know that how the class is taught is 100% correlated to what you get out of that class. And we take classes because of teachers and just as much as because of the material. So I think this was a really positive experience for me as a student. So.
Okay. So I'm Jeff Gill. I'm a graduate student that works with Dr. Chiel. And I've been an instructor, a co-instructor for this course for 2 years now, I think. And I have to say that the most rewarding part for me when I'm teaching this course is actually getting to talk to the students face-to-face every day. There's nothing like being there at the moment when a student who's passionate about the material suddenly gets it and it clicks for them. And you can be there to help them get it, but they're understanding it on their own. So what we do is we, as Dr. Chiel said, talk to them every day about what they should have completed for that day. We look over their work briefly, and then we ask them in-depth questions that may not have been directly asked in the problem sets. But if they have obtained mastery of the material, then they should be able to answer those types of questions. So you can probe students and see how much they understand, and you could even push the better students further by asking them harder questions. So that's just really exciting as someone who enjoys teaching, to be able to see how much the students understand and see them suddenly understand things that they didn't know before. And then I'll add that I took this course as an undergraduate when it was still a lecture course, and it was at 8:30 in the morning, as it is still now, but I'll admit that my enthusiasm was lower. I wasn't always entirely awake, and I don't think I learned nearly as much as the students do now.
Let me just add one or two quick things. Part of the way we deal with the question you asked, which is how do you deal with the challenging aspects and the brighter students? Some of what Jennifer said is similar. We have built in several what we call design and analysis units. So instead of just a unit where let's describe how things change when you play with it, we also say, can you build something that does X? Or, for example, let's say you're given two different kinds of neurons, one that was taken from an adult rat and then one was taken from a newly born, a neonatal rat, and you're given a set of drugs which affect certain of these special currents that you've learned about. Can you tell what's different as an animal goes through the developmental process by using these drugs to work out how those two neurons are different from each other? Well, these are exactly the kinds of questions, if you were in a laboratory, you might actually have a research project that did that. And if you were an engineer, and we have engineers taking this course, and you wanted to build, for example, something that could rhythmically oscillate on its own, a pacemaker type neuron, well, we're giving you the tools, and then you can play around and make them happen. And what Diane was saying was something that I very much liked. The best students would actually play with the simulations. They'd have fun, which is, is allowed in a learning environment. So that's all I had to say. I'm happy to take questions now. And please direct them not just to me, but to the students as well. Yes?
I think this was probably directed to you, but I'm just kind of interested from a neurophysiological perspective, is that we have students that are actually expending energy, like in the classroom, actively involved, as opposed, and then what's like the fatigue after that, as opposed to the students that are bored in a class, and it's like they're falling asleep. I mean, have you looked at it from that perspective?
Yeah. I mean, again, learning styles are very different, and having students being able to talk to each other, to actually be interacting with the computer and then talking to one another and then doing entries in their notebook, means that throughout the class, instead of listening and occasionally taking notes, they're in an active mode. And when we come and sit with them, we're having a conversation. And again, it takes time. I don't see myself as a scary person, but I am a senior professor, so I can't help that. That's who I am at this point. But Jeff is much less scary. And initially students are very hesitant to have a conversation with a professor because they don't look stupid and so forth. But I'll ask questions, and then how you respond is very important. And if the students see they're having a good social interaction, the professors actually, I get a kick if the students are understanding things. They see I'm smiling and I'm happy and I'm enthusiastic. That also creates a very different kind of motivation or contextual framework for the learning process. So I talked briefly about this. Learning how to learn involves figuring out what your learning style is, and then creating an environment or a context in which whatever's best for you for doing learning is happening. And so we make the students conscious of that, and we try to get them to reflect on that. Actually, in a questionnaire we ask them, and how well do you know these concepts, and how well do you think these different things are contributing to the learning process, so that we're trying to get them to think about that. But yeah, being active is a huge difference. Students are very busy. Some students pull all-nighters, so occasionally a student will fall asleep in class. That does happen. But usually we'll try to go over gently, or they have a teammate who needs them, and then they're back.
Can I also respond to that? When I was taking this course, I had 8:30 classes every day, and I had this course on Tuesday, Thursday, and it was, I'd leave this course so much more energized each day, because in my other course, you're fighting to stay awake, and you have to use all of these little mechanisms to keep yourself engaged, and it is a lot of work, and you're being taught at crazy speeds, and you have to write notes really fast, whereas this course, because it was engaged and you could go sort of more at your own pace and then finish on your own, I always left so much more energized. And it was really surprising because I'm not a morning person, and it was an 8:30 course.
Think about, because you're really expending energy, like, and then the other, you're thinking you're not as a passive learner, but you somehow it's taking an impact on you. One we don't want to have.
And one of the things I would joke about this is when I gave lectures, I would talk, when I got to the section where I talked about the reticular activating system, I would talk about the importance of serotonergic and other transmitters, and I'd say, and for example, many of you are having difficulty staying awake right now because that whole system is shutting down. I have this nice soothing voice, it's early in the morning, you were up really, really late, and then they kind of, oh, yes, that's right. I don't have to do that. That trick is not necessary because they're engaged themselves. So it's really very positive.
How much of the work, Jennifer, was done in class, and what percentage was left for you to do on your own?
It depended on the particular assignment that day. I think for me, on average, well, we get to class and we started doing the work right away, because we had read beforehand and all of the work that we had to do was outlined for us. And we'd usually, I'd say, get through maybe half of the assignment. But again, it varied a lot on days. There were days when we were almost completely done. There were days when we had only done the first few problems, but then we'd split up and usually do most of it on our own, unless we were having trouble, in which me and my group mate would meet and we'd work on it together some more. So I'd say maybe an hour and a half outside of class on average. So
It varies a lot by the student, and some students use their time very effectively and very efficiently, some much less so. But that's an issue. Jeff can tell you, we joke about this. Coverage for response to emails goes from 8 a.m. till 8 a.m. because he tends to be up very, very early in the morning, and then I get up very early in the morning. So students could send us stuff, but we warned them not to wait till the very last minute. But what was very cool also, and this is what I liked most about the last part of the course, towards the end, after you'd learned all these basic neuroscience mechanisms, we had the students actually analyzing a simple circuit that other people had worked out, but they had a simulation for. We didn't tell them the names of the neurons or what they did. It's like the chemical unknowns problem that you sometimes get in inorganic chemistry. And some of the students loved this because they were actually figuring out the relationship between each of the neurons, whether it caused a behavior or whether it took inputs in and how it connected with the other neurons. They were drawing a circuit. And this is exactly the kind of research that someone would do if they were actually working in a neuroscience laboratory. And that was the other message that I was trying to get across to the students, and I would get across to my fellow faculty members. If teaching and research can be made as seamless as possible, you are going to be incredibly energized as a faculty member because you're talking about the stuff you love, because research is my first love. I like teaching, but I love research. But if the actual process of teaching is like the research experience, it's going to be incredibly energizing for the faculty member. And then, if the students get into it, first of all, these are your informed citizens of the future. Many of whom will never do research and won't stay in the area, but they'll know what it's like and they'll have a feeling for it. And a few of them, maybe, you could recruit for your own laboratory. Ooh, cool. So all of those are very strong motivators to make this a really good experience for both the students and the teachers. You got a question?
I was just going to say, it sounds like part of what you want students to come out with is not just information, but skills.
I go back to my carpentry example. If a student can not build a chair, but knows the names of tools, I haven't taught them anything. But if they start to read a science article, or they hear in the popular press some new stuff about memory and hippocampus, and they start hearing about glutamate receptors and their role in long-term potentiation, and they actually recognize those terms, and if they sat down and read the article, they could actually not only understand it, but maybe even catch some simplifications that have been made that aren't quite accurate. I think I've done my job.
So I actually have more than multiple questions, but I'll just ask two of them. One for Diana. Could you identify which aspects of this learning experience were most useful to you, or anything like that? Do you have a preference? I mean, or was it like one big beautiful thing.
I guess one big beautiful experience. This one big terrifying experience is what it was. I mean, setting this up and having it ready in time and so forth. Jeff and I can go on at length about this. But it is beautiful when you see the students actually grasping, and it is very rewarding. I guess the issue is this, and this is the seamless idea between research and teaching. By the end of the semester, when things were working, and this happened for most of the students, I felt I was talking to colleagues. I wasn't having a conversation with students where they have to try to impress me or show off what they know. We were having a serious discussion about a scientific topic together. And we have very bright students at Case. So some of the brightest students would be asking these really challenging, exciting questions, some which went beyond my level of understanding. But, I could pull up Google or something and say, here, this is something that, we could look at together. Another thing I should mention that was actually very cool, and I guess I could show this briefly. For the graduate students, I haven't focused on this because this is an undergraduate course, but let me just show you something that the graduate students are asked to do. They either are asked to write a grant, a critical review, or a Wikipedia entry. So if I type in neurotoxin, this article was actually largely written by one of the students in Introduction to Neurobiology about 3 years ago, Luther Liggett. There was a stub here, because people were interested in this, but he went and actually did this, and we had him provide benchmarks and so forth. So here's one of our students actually contributing to the larger range of knowledge outside the class, and that's also very exciting to me. So these are things that I can look back on and say, yeah, that was cool.
As to the most beneficial part of the course, I think I would say that it's really broad, I'm sorry, but all of the course was good, but I think it was the fact that instead of being told facts and concepts and how things worked, we had to figure them out. And because we figured them out, when we were finally given and here is the formula, we were like, well, yeah. It made perfect sense, and it was just sort of, it's written down there. And because of that, it's so easy to remember. I've been able to apply stuff from my neurobiology course to a whole bunch of other courses in biology, just because I have all of this command over the material that I remember it, I can bring it up, and I can apply it to other things. And I think that's largely because we figured it out on our own. We read the material and we figured it out through the simulations, but I think it was because we figured it out. Does that make sense?
I do want to jump in and comment. It's a debate, but there's this argument that constructing knowledge is a crucial part of actually learning things. Part of the reason I actually like teaching is that I find that I really don't understand what I know or don't know until I try to teach it to somebody else. And so, again, that's one big piece of this. The other thing is that this finding out is what research is about. And so the things that are somewhat hard-won knowledge that you have gotten yourself is yours. It's not somebody else's, it's your own knowledge. Other questions?
The one other question I had for you is, I'd be interested to know how you developed the course, rather than seeing this in its final form. But what previous iterations did you go through that maybe somewhat worked, and you? Let
me take just a minute to address that. In 2008, there's another course I teach, which Diana's now taking, called Dynamics of Biological Systems. And that course I started in 2000, and from the very beginning, I had lectures in the first half. The second half, students build models. In 2008, in part with Kendrick's prodding, I decided to flip the classroom and to have the students do reading outside of class of lecture material I had developed into essentially a textbook, but written in Mathematica so they could steal code and use it in their own assignments, and have them focus on problems. And in that year, we saw, I would say, a full grade increase in the quality of the student work. Because instead of at the beginning of the second half of the semester, students really don't know what to do. They've had lectures, they had problem sets, but when you ask them, now sit down and put some differential equations into the solver for Mathematica and get them to work, clueless. Whereas now, after the first half, That's like, well, how many dimensions do I have here? That's okay, I just have to make sure I don't make typing problems, as opposed to like, what are you asking me? That's impossible. So that was one thing that opened my eyes to that, gee, flipping and doing this way could make a huge difference. In 2009, what Kendrick and I did is he built a bunch of simulations using a open program called Neuron and some Python glue. And then we had mini lectures where we would talk a little bit about what was going on, and then the students would work on the simulations. And we were very pressed for time. So the next iteration, I was on sabbatical in 2010, we did a little further work, but in 2011, I basically transferred all of my lecture notes onto the wiki. So now the students, when they clicked onto that unit, had all the material to read, which we could ask them to do in advance, and the simulations and the problems. And again, it was rather pressured. Now, what we had done in that iteration in 2011 was okay, and in the second half, we had students reading in the technical literature and giving presentations, which was good for them for mastering presentations, but wasn't as exciting. And one of the students, actually more than one of the students, said, you know, if we could just do simulations all the way through. So that was what we did this semester, and Jeff was on the firing line for that. And I can tell you last summer was a rather tense time as we went through and made sure that all the simulations would work, because one thing you don't want is the students click on a simulation and there's nothing there. And we got pretty much through most of the first half, 3/4 of the semester before the semester began. And then we got through the end of the semester by the end of the semester. So we were, you know, again, it was not a relaxing experience. I don't think the students perceived the stress that we were under. For them, it worked seamlessly. But it's a terrifying process. It's an enormous amount of work. You have to be insane to do this. You have to get help either from the IT people or from grad students or whatever. And it's incredibly worthwhile. Do I have to stop?
Well, we're out of time.
Could I take one question?
We can take one more question.
Barb?
Thanks, Hillel. I have a nuts and bolts question. And this has to do with constructing knowledge. So looking at the very first simulation that you showed us, and you fired an action potential sooner than it would give us another one.
Right.
So were the students reading about refractory periods before that, or were they figuring it out after?
No, what we did, now, someone like Diana could actually choose to play around with this and do that. But what we had, so let me just take a moment to show you this. So that unit, the qualitative introduction and current clamp, this is the actual reading material. Passive versus active signal propagation in the nervous system. Why are action potentials important? Here's a qualitative introduction to the action potential. How does it work, both overall and at the level of the membrane and the ions? Here's a picture of an action potential. Then here is the first simulation, which when they click on, they saw what I showed you. And then there's a set of questions that they work on to play with and do experiments, virtual experiments, to understand more. So they're given the reading to do in advance. If they want to start playing with the simulations and working the questions, that's up to them. We don't have any problem with that. But what they're supposed to do in class is work with the simulation, answer problems, work together with each other. And what's nice is we have things arranged in tables like this. Students have their laptops. And what happened was, what we found is not only teams, but tables would interact. Where, you know, sometimes a team worked reasonably well, but they get stuck on something, they ask the rest of the table, and we encourage that. It's great. So that's how that worked.
Okay, I think I would love to listen to you guys talk at least another hour, because I actually have questions, even though I know pretty well. I have questions about your course, but I think we need to take a break and thank our speakers for coming today.
Thank you for being here.